Good evening. Welcome to everyone to University of Bristol. My name is Nishan Kanagaraja. I'm one of the Pro-Vice Chancellors in the university. I bring the apologies from the Vice Chancellor who is in China. And if you're expecting him, you will recognize that I can't be him because our accents are very different. He's Irish, I'm Sri Lankan. And our Deputy Vice Chancellor can't be here either. He's in London attending an important meeting on behalf of the Vice Chancellor. And again, if you're expecting him, you would know it's not him because I don't have the physical stature that he has. But it's a real pleasure for me to welcome you all on behalf of the university to this special event organized by the Cabot Institute, the Public and Ceremonial Events, and the Arthur Mannering Tyndall. Sorry, I've pressed the wrong button. I'll escape that for the moment. And we are here to celebrate a special event. It's the University of Bristol's Queen's Anniversary Prize, which was awarded to the Volcanology Research Group. And today we are celebrating with the title of Living with Volcanoes in the 21st Century. So most of you will know the Queen's Anniversary Prize is a very prestigious award that is awarded to academic institutions. So naturally, we are very proud of that. And this indicates the excellent work and the quality of the research that is done in this university that also has impact to the wider society. We in the university know how fantastic our volcanology group is. It's very well recognized by our peers internationally. But this is an indication that externally, by people like the Queen's Anniversary, the panel that judges quality of research that has a real impact to the wider society, to have that recognition is another endorsement of the quality of the work that's done here. So earlier this year, our Vice Chancellor and the Chair of Board of Trustees and Professor Cathy Cashman went to Buckingham Palace to receive the award, and the pictures are there in the university, and we're very proud of that. But today, we are really pleased that we have the opportunity to showcase and celebrate that outstanding work with you. And the work of the Volcanology Group is having an impact at a global scale. From Guatemala to Iceland, from Nicaragua to Japan, these researchers are working to make people's lives safer, build the resilience of vulnerable nations and communities, ensure safer international travel, and help to protect essential infrastructure. The group is also a leading partner in the Global Volcano Model Network, a network of 28 institutions around the world dedicated to understanding the volcanoes and the risk they pose. And if that's not enough, this is also a highly interdisciplinary group with numerous connections to policy and practice. So tonight's panel exemplifies this with natural scientists, historians, and social scientists working together. And we are really pleased. We have Frank Savage, the chairman of the Commonwealth Disaster Management Agency, who was also the governor of Montserrat during the volcano eruption, and Sir John Beddington, former chief scientific advisor to the UK government. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you this evening. By combining these many disciplines and perspective within the Cabot Institute, which is one of the university research institutes that promotes multidisciplinary working, we seek to stimulate the best novel research with greatest potential for societal impact. We are not here just to celebrate and raise awareness of the work that is happening in this university. During this event, we also outline the challenges yet to come and discuss how Bristol, with its partners, can lead the way in building resilience around the world to volcanic research. So now I want to introduce our speaker for this evening, Professor Steve Sparks. As a graduate student in the 1970s, Steve became one of the first to apply maths and physics to the interpretation of volcano deposits in the field, bringing volcanology into the modern era. His methodical, collaborative approach has produced a long list of discoveries that have improved understanding of volcanoes and volcanic hazards globally. In 1978, Steve moved to University of Cambridge, where he and mathematician Herbert Uppert worked on the physics of magma chambers beneath volcanoes. And in the lab, they demonstrated how heavy magma can become unstable and counterintuitively rise. In 1989, Steve and geochemist Bernie Wood were tapped to lead the University of Bristol's geology department. It is one of our successful departments doing fantastic research and teaching in this university. Here, in a country with no volcanoes of its own, they built one of the world's leading centers of volcanology and the earth sciences. Since then, Steve has worked on Montserrat Sophia Hills volcano, heading up monitoring efforts there and advising the government, has shown how small pressure variations in volcano's magma chamber or in the stickiness of its magma can create wild mood swings, turning a gently oozing eruption into something explosive. He has pioneered methods for assessing the dangers posed by active volcanic eruptions, helping governments to improve decisions about evacuations and rebuilding. Assessed by the Safety of All Volcanoes in Britain, Japan, and the United States for storing radioactive waste. Coordinated a global assessment of volcanic risk for the United Nations. In 2015, Steve won the Vetelson Prize, widely considered to be the Nobel Prize for Earth Sciences, as a geologist who modernized volcanology. And in 2016, under Professor Kathy Cashman's leadership, the group that they established was awarded, as I mentioned, the Queen's Anniversary Prize. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Steve Sparks to give the 30-minute presentation, and after that, we will have a panel discussion. Steve.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nishan, and welcome everyone to Bristol to hear about the volcanology work we do. And I'm going to try and paint a broad picture of the kind of situation we're facing in the 21st century in terms of volcanoes. And so I thought I'd start by giving you some interesting facts about volcanoes. There's about 551 volcanoes which have been historically active. But there's actually over 1,500 active volcanoes, so almost two-thirds have not had an historical eruption. And in fact, about every 2 years, there's a volcano somewhere on the Earth which starts to erupt, which has got no previous historical record. And sometimes those eruptions take place in very populated areas, and the citizens in those areas have no idea that really there's an issue until their volcano starts to erupt. And it's usually those sorts of volcanoes, rather than the people who live on a very active volcano, where you get the really serious volcanic emergencies. And I'll come back to that point later on. There's been about 250,000 historical fatalities. The economic costs are very high, and I'll give you some examples. Very large eruptions actually perturb the whole global climate and can actually have effects which are a long way from where the actual volcano is. But of course, we've got a world in which the population is growing almost exponentially. So even in the last few years, we've gone up to 800 million people who live within 100 kilometers of an active volcano. So it's a growing risk for those people. Just have a look at a couple of examples of historical tragedies. In Montpellier, Martinique, 29,000 people were killed. This is 1902, and you can see the devastation from a volcanic explosion. And virtually the entire population were killed. And it's an example of the interface between politics and science, because actually the volcano was showing small signs of activity, and some of the doctors and engineers in the town thought that the town should be evacuated. But the elections were going on, and the politicians delayed, and they delayed too long with tragic results. This is the town which I'll talk quite a lot about later on, called El Mero in Colombia in 1985. And the town is actually underneath there, and 23,000 people lost their lives. And it was a relatively small eruption which took place on a glaciated volcano, where the small eruption melted the ice, and a big, huge flood called a lahar came down through the town, and the people weren't warned. And it was clear that it was a lack of communication, in a sense, which led to this tragedy. So these are some of the tragedies that we really want to avoid. Now, what I'm going to show you now is a short film. I'm not going to comment on it, but it's going to show you some activity about volcanoes. And it's Professor Ian Stewart, the BBC presenter.
Pyroclastic flows are one of the most deadly of volcanic hazards. They are rapidly moving avalanches of hot rock, dust and gas that flow down the sides of a volcano and into surrounding valleys. They can climb up and over ridges and high ground. They are dangerous because they flow much faster than a person can run, and often faster than a car. So for those in their path, there's little chance of escape. What makes them especially lethal and devastating is that they're extremely hot. During the day they appear grey and ashy, but at night they can be seen glowing red hot. They destroy and burn anything in their way. Death or severe injury is certain for those caught by a pyroclastic flow. There are two main ways pyroclastic flows may form. Sometimes a volcano explodes and forms a fountain of hot pulverised rock and gas that first rapidly rises into the sky and then falls back, forming pyroclastic flows which race down the sides of the volcano. Other times, instead of an explosion, sticky lava oozes out of a volcano and piles up around the summit. Pyroclastic flows can then form by parts of the lava collapsing. Although pyroclastic flows normally move down valleys, extremely hot, fast-moving, billowing clouds form above them, which can spill out of valleys. This means that even people on high ground are not safe. Pyroclastic flows normally travel to distances of 5 to 10 kilometres from the volcano's summit, but in the biggest eruptions may reach much more than 20 kilometres. Volcanoes that haven't erupted for many decades or even centuries may appear peaceful, but when they awaken, the eruptions are often very large and explosive. Scientists can detect that a volcano is reawakening and are able to provide some warning or advice to evacuate, which is the only protection from pyroclastic flows.
Right, so the background to this film is that about a year ago we got funded by the World Bank to do a pilot project which would be coordinated from Bristol with international colleagues. And the idea was to make films designed for those people who live on volcanoes which have not erupted historically, so that when their volcano erupts, they can get basic public information about the volcanoes. And this one, it was designed to show what the danger of pyroclastic flows. Now, these films are still in development. This is not the final version. We think it's near the final version. But you'll see bits of paper, and I'm going to show you 2 other short films towards the end. And it'd be very nice if you could just fill out the forms and give your impression of your broad impressions of the three films, because we're going through an evaluation process in Vanuatu, New Zealand, the United States, the Caribbean, and Ecuador, and France at the moment, and so it'd be good to hear what this audience thinks of these films. But it's good that I've been able to show you, hopefully that film did tell you what a pyroclastic flow is and why it's not a good idea to be around when one comes down your valley. And so I'm going to continue by talking about a few crises which illustrate various points about volcanoes. The first one is Montserrat, which is the Caribbean island, which is a UK-dependent territory, which started to erupt in 1995. It's quite close to Antigua, and to sort of locate, if you've been on holiday in Antigua, that would be a good place to locate it. But it's essentially a UK island. And we're, in fact, lucky enough to have on the panel tonight Frank Savage, who was the governor of the island when the volcano started to erupt, and he's going to be on the panel and tell us about some of the, undoubtedly about some of the difficult issues which were raised during the eruption. Just a little bit about the pictures. You can see the 850 degrees centigrade lava. You can see the town of Plymouth completely buried by the deposits from pyroclastic flows. You can see the British government built a nice hospital for £30 million in 1992, just in the wrong place, down a valley where pyroclastic flow was going to come. And this shows you the idea of societal resilience. This guy went out of the danger zone and just picked up his car and put it on a truck and moved to the north. There's 9,000 people were relocated outside the island. There were 20 deaths. It's estimated, this is back in 2003, about $1 billion of losses. And the estimated cost so far for the British government is around £600 million, or about £30 million per year, because it destroyed the economy of the island. So that's an example of a case where we can see some of the economic losses. And also, this is another good example. This is the Merapi eruption in 2010. I went out there in 2011 to look at it. And this is a huge volcano. And in the footprint of the hazardous area, there are 400,000 people. And 400,000 people had to be evacuated when it started to erupt in November 2010. There were 350 people killed. And that's, of course, tragic, but actually, because of the actions of the scientists on the Indonesian and US scientists on the ground, it's estimated that probably about 20,000 people's lives were saved by timely evacuation. And the pyroclastic flow, which is this grey material, went about twice as far as any previous pyroclastic flow. It went almost 20 kilometres, so it caused a tremendous problem. If we just look at some of that's a village of where many of the casualties were. Brongang, you can see it's burnt and destroyed by the pyroclastic flow. And this is an example of where they'd built a dam, and the dam actually diverted the pyroclastic flow into the village. So it's a sort of unintended consequences of engineering that they'd built a dam, and if the dam hadn't been there, there wouldn't have been this tragedy. And when I was out there, which was several months after the eruption, this is the refugee camp of the people whose homes were destroyed. And there were still 20,000 people living in tents several months after the eruption. So we've seen some examples of local effects around volcanoes, but of course we shouldn't think that because we live in the UK and we have no volcanoes, we're not affected by them. And I suspect quite a few people in this audience were inconvenienced by the eruptions in Iceland in 2010. My wife actually was stuck in Johannesburg airport for 6 days, which wasn't the greatest to have experienced, because she couldn't fly back to the UK, because, as you know, they stopped all the flights. And this is a picture showing you the volcanic ash coming from Iceland towards the UK. And again, we're lucky in the chair of our panel is Sir John Beddington, as Nishan already mentioned, Chief Government Scientist at the time of this crisis. And Sir John had a lot of experience of dealing with what was really a sort of major emergency for the UK from a volcano. So if we're unlucky, this just gives you a satellite image. I just want to sort of say why it was such a difficult problem. This is an image from satellites which shows you in green and reds where the ash was at different times. You can see it's a pretty complicated pattern. So it meant that it was very difficult, firstly, to predict where the ash exactly would go, because the weather is very complicated. And as you can see, it covered quite a lot of Europe. So it's very difficult to find flight paths through it which were going to miss the ash. So that's the reason why this was such a difficult occasion. I should have mentioned that this eruption grounded aircraft flying out of Europe for 6 days. It's estimated it cost the aviation industry around £200 million a day. So it was a very costly event as well. So volcanoes, it's not just even if we live in a country without volcanoes, we still can be affected by them. Now, this is some work that some of my colleagues, Jeremy Phillip and Willie Aspinall, is doing jointly with EDF, the nuclear company, of course, building Hinkley Point. And this is an ongoing work which is basically to look at how ash spreads from Iceland across the UK in simulated crises. And the point about that is the nuclear industry, if you've got a nuclear power plant, you don't want very fine volcanic ash getting into your filters and your equipment in a nuclear power station. So EDF are very interested in this problem and trying to predict how often this might actually happen and what the impact might be. So that's a bit of ongoing work that we're doing, again, of great interest to the country. Okay, well, a big question I think I get everybody who listens to talk on volcanoes asks is, what's the biggest and the best volcano, particularly in a group? So I'm going to talk very briefly about very large explosive eruptions. The last really big eruption we had on Earth the kind of eruption that only takes place roughly every 250 years was Tambora in 1815, where 30 cubic kilometres of material was erupted. An enormous amount. It's difficult to imagine a cube, 30 cubic kilometres, but it's a pretty big cube. And that was spread around the world. And there's lots of manifestations of that, but it put pollution into the whole global atmosphere and perturbed the climate. And in fact, reduced the next year in 1816, the Earth's climate was reduced by about 1.5 degrees centigrade because of this pollution. And William Turner, the artist, painted a series of wonderful paintings in 1816 of the sunsets as this pollution, scattered sunlight. You can also see a more serious effect. The price of wheat in the United States tripled in 1816. It led to starvation both in Europe and in the United States. And people in Maine described the frosts in July of 1816 as producing thick frosts as thick as window glass. And the crops were destroyed in New England. If you go to New England, if you know Connecticut and places like that, that landscape is actually formed to some extent by the 1815 eruption of Tambora, because a lot of the farmers abandoned their farms, they were never recovered, and they went back to being forests, and they went to the west. So these eruptions can have global effects. So that's 30 cubic kilometres. So what happens when we have an eruption which is 100 times bigger than that? Well, this is what happens. You get the world's biggest volcanic crater called Toba. And just to give you a scale, this is a Google Earth. This is 100 kilometres this length and about 40 kilometres this length. So it's sort of Bath to Reading in one direction, and I suppose sort of Bristol to Cardiff, I suppose, in the other direction. It's absolutely enormous. And in that eruption, 74,000 years ago, 3,500 cubic kilometres were erupted. And we know from ice core records that took place in a few years, probably less. And the global pollution from this lasted for 20 years. You can see the pollution landing in the Antarctic ice cores from this eruption. Now, fortunately, these eruptions only happen once every 30,000 years, the so-called super eruptions. But they do happen. But fortunately for us, it's very unlikely that we'll experience an eruption like this on Earth in our lifetime. Nevertheless, they will happen. Geologically, there have been many of them. And this is some Met Office modelling work, which is to look at what happens in the summer and the winter. If it's very blue, it means it's much more cold than average. If it's red, it's much hotter than average. And the Met Office people have modelled this, and they find that the cooling is of the order of 10 degrees centigrade. That's twice as much as a full glaciation of the Earth. But of course, it only lasts a few years, but you'd have to go through several years of an extraordinarily perturbed climate, a much cooler climate. And you'll see it's not simple, because the polar regions, the Arctic, actually warms up. And that's because this pollution makes the equator much warmer, so what's called the Hadley cell goes to the north, and we get much warmer weather in the polar region, particularly the North Pole. So this would be a pretty dramatic thing to happen to the Earth, but as I say, only about one every 30,000, so I think we're okay. Right, now before I show you these I'm going to finish with these two videos. I'll give you a little bit of background. One of the projects that we've got funded recently is from the World Bank, and they gave us money through Global Volcano Model to coordinate from Bristol films to communicate about hazards. I've shown you one of those already with Ian Stewart, and I'm going to show you two more, one on Lhasa and one on what people experience from Lhasa, only 2 minutes or so each. And we'd certainly like your reaction to them, but the point is that they are aimed at people who may not know very much about volcanoes at all, and we're going to have them translated into many different languages. So I'll show you the first one, which is about Lhasa.
A major danger on many volcanoes comes from floods of water mixed with volcanic debris.
Right, well, that really concludes my talk. Just to say that we've literally last week we heard from the World Bank that they're going to give us a substantial amount. They like these films, and they're going to give us a substantial amount of more money. And we're going to focus probably more on producing the film, like the last kind of film that you saw, which is people who've experienced hazards and then can explain what they experienced and what impact it had on their lives. We think that's a very effective way of communicating, as well as the more, if you like, the science part. So if you do fill out your forms, we'd be very welcome. We're still modifying these films at the moment. We hope to put them online, free for the public, on YouTube, probably in about February. Thank you very much. I think I can take some questions. So a small number of questions before we start the panel discussion. Oh, yes. Yes.
Yes, the last super eruption was 75,000 years ago. They happen every 30,000 years, but we've got nothing to worry about. Perhaps you could clarify.
Well, actually, the last super eruption wasn't in Sumatra, it was in New Zealand. It was 23,000 years ago. And there we had 500 cubic kilometres. It wasn't quite as big as Toba, but it was enormous. It covered the entire North Island of New Zealand in volcanic ash. And it was a huge event. It formed the lake, those of you know New Zealand, it formed Lake Taupo. So that was the most recent we've had. I think that as we've got a much more crowded world, if we had the sort of eruption that happened in Tambora in the modern Earth, it would have quite an impact. We're in a very interconnected world, a much more populated world. Disasters tend to disrupt supply chains, which drives international trade. It'll produce climate. It'll make some places drier, some places wetter. There'll be all sorts of changes, even with the sort of eruption that might have about a 1 in 3 chance of happening this century. So I think those sorts of eruptions is where we should focus our effort in trying to understand their impact.
Yeah, I think that's my question, is how can you categorically say that the next one will be in 30,000 years?
It doesn't work like that, unfortunately. That's right. They're not regular. They're totally random. They follow what the mathematician Poisson described back in the late in the Napoleonic Wars. That they're random. So there's an average, if you like, gap between them. But it could be 1,000 years. It could be 60,000 years. Could be next week, exactly. Yes, it's a random series, so it's not a regular thing at all, unfortunately.
The first question is, who exactly are these films aimed at? If you're aiming at ordinary people, what can they do about it? If you're aiming at people in positions of power or whatever, that's another matter. There seem very interesting films, but my question is, what's going to happen as a result of them. One other thing I'll comment is that we, as you know, we do run these UK-Japan Young Scientist workshops, and we've been working quite a few years now with people in in Tohoku, in the Fukushima area. And as a result of I see echoes of the response there. Mm-hmm. As a result of that, everybody now, all the schools and whatever, have all sort of evacuation plans of where to go to higher ground and all that sort of stuff. But that's a result of a big shake-up. How are you going to sort of do things with these in other places?
Yes, it's a question that's quite complicated to answer. I think in a nutshell, they're rather general films. They're aimed at the public, but they're also aimed at decision makers and civil protection people so that they understand what's going on. They do try and give... I haven't shown you all the films. There's another film which looks at impact. And they also give you, for example, the cartoons show people simple information like run uphill. for example, whereas you wouldn't give that advice for pyroclastic flows because they go uphill. So very simple, they're trying to make very simple points about these hazards and show through films and animation what the hazards are about. It's difficult to make general films because it's obviously better to target. If you have a film for young children, that's totally different from a film to a group of civil protection people. Yes. Well, I think I've got one more because we need to go into the panel.
One of the
technologists towards actually being able to warn people in time for them to get out?
We're doing better and better. Volcanoes often give warnings of weeks, days, or hours. Sometimes they don't, which is a bit of a problem, but by and large, they often give telltale signs which are the warning of an impending eruption. So as the science has progressed, we've got better and better. We're by no means perfect, and to some extent, there's some aspects of them which are unpredictable, but the field is progressing, I think, pretty well. I think I should draw a conclusion so we can get on with the panel discussions. Thank you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Beddington, and I was sort of prefaced in some of the comments before. For 5 or 6 years, I was the UK Chief Scientific Advisor, sort of appointed by Tony Blair, worked for Gordon Brown and worked for David Cameron, and the compare and contrast will probably have to wait until I clear the Official Secrets Act or write my memoirs. But I was involved in the volcanic ash incident largely because part of my job was to chair an advisory committee to government in the event of any emergency. And one of the emergencies that came out from the volcanic ash explosion in Iceland was one which had actually essentially, and as Steve has already shown it, actually closed a very significant amount of air traffic in the Eastern Atlantic. Now, as Chief Scientific Advisor, you have a few problems. The biggest problem I had was actually how to pronounce the name of the volcano, which, in common with many other Icelandic names, had one vowel and 23 consonants. And I never learned to actually pronounce its name properly. And indeed, when I was on the Today programme, I rather enjoyed trying to hear John Humphreys pronounce it incorrectly 4 times. And so we kind of agreed we'd call it the volcano, which was a good and useful standoff for us all. But just to give you a flavour for this, the British government has a thing called its National Risk Register. And we didn't have volcanoes on our National Risk Register. You know, like the acute amongst you will notice, we don't have a lot of volcanoes in the United Kingdom. And so we didn't have it. But of course, we quite clearly should have, because Iceland is not far away. And if you look at the historical record, give or take, you get a volcanic eruption in Iceland about every 4 years. And that's been going back, and the Icelandic nation has had very, very detailed records going back to well over 1,000 years. So we had pretty good information that this was actually going to happen. And frankly, we should have had it. It was clearly one of the risks that we had to address. And of course, that risk probably would have been minimal at times prior to the international air travel. But actually, and Steve didn't mention this in his talk, but there was a very, very severe eruption in Iceland, not the sort that we've been seeing, but actually went on for several months, spewing essentially sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, which actually brought major social change in Europe. There is some talk that it actually led to the French Revolution. Now, I stepped down as Chief Scientific Advisor 2 years ago, and one of the things that it amused me was saying that, you know, I did the calculation that how likely was my successor going to survive 5 years in office without having a major emergency, whether it was some pandemic influenza, or whether it was a volcanic ash, or indeed the sort of thing that we heard mentioned in the question about the terrible disaster in northeast Japan. And I have to say, it was very satisfactory to work out he had only a 1 chance in 80 of going through 5 years without a major emergency he had to deal with. You know, a slightly selfish and silly calculation, but there we are. But tonight, we're very privileged to have some eminent panellists. We have Professor Catherine Cashman, who is a Fellow of the Royal Society, and I will ask her when she, very shortly, to give a couple of words about what she actually does. We have Ryerson Christie, who is in our sociology department. He's a senior lecturer in the development MSc. And we have Frank Savage, who Steve has already alluded to, as being the person on the spot when as governor of Montserrat when the volcano there went up. So, Kathy, if I may, I'll just ask you to give a couple of sentences saying what you do, go around the panel, and then I have already got some questions from the audience to kick the whole thing off. So over to you, Kathy.
Okay. Well, you can tell right away by my accent that I'm not from here. And in fact, I arrived in the UK, or I came to Bristol about 5.5 years ago as a direct result of the Icelandic eruption, which I will also not try to pronounce. But also, given my accent, those of you who know anything about volcanoes might guess that I really got my start in volcanology at another signature eruption that Steve only mentioned briefly in passing, but that's the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. And that not only introduced me to volcanoes and volcano monitoring, but my job initially was as public information scientist, and that was with virtually no training in volcanology. I had a master's in geochemistry, and no training in public communication, so I definitely had to learn on the fly. But it was extremely good training for a career in volcanology because it gave me immediately a really intense appreciation of the need to communicate very broadly, and that as volcanologists we can't just sit in the lab and do our science.
Okay, thank you. Ryerson.
Thank you. So my background is taking a look at peace-building, post-conflict societies, where I've been examining the relationship between communities, security experts, and war and conflict. I was at a workshop that was put together by the Cabot Institute, and at that workshop I was approached by one of our colleagues in volcanology, Joe Gottsman, and asked the question, why can't people listen to scientists during an impending disaster? To which my immediate response is, why do you expect they should? And that, I guess, started a relationship where we've been looking at a number of these issues. So for the past 4 years, I've been drawn into this volcanology house, and I've been doing work in Ecuador, a little bit in Indonesia, Mexico, interviewing locals about their sense of insecurity, trying to make sense of why people are going to listen or not listen, not just to scientists, but to the disaster managers as well.
Thank you. So, Frank.
Thank you. Good evening. I was the hapless chap who was in charge of Montserrat when the volcano kicked off. I arrived in '93, and Montserrat was recovering from the most devastating hurricane to have hit a Caribbean island in over 50 years. And the island had just put itself back together, including building new parliament building, new government headquarters, new hospitals, all in the capital. The problem was that 60% of the population and 80% of the infrastructure was within 4 miles of the volcano. Montserrat was paradise at that point. The community was very positive. They'd put their economy back together. And if you've ever met any Montserratians, they are amongst the best people in the world. On the 18th of July, there was a major incident which was to change that, I won't say forever, but certainly up until this point. The very first scientist to arrive the second day was Professor Joe Devine from Brown University. who was just happening to be flying through the Caribbean, and he dropped in. And I still remember his chilling words. He took me to one side and he said, you are on a hiding to nothing. If you jump every time the scientists say jump, you will create the cry wolf factor. Or if you don't listen, you might be caught out like the mayor of Saint-Pierre when 29,000 people died on the first day.
Frank, I'll stop you there because we're going to have some questioning, so if that's all right. So thank you very much for that introduction. Look, I've got 3 questions which have come from carefully selected relatives of the panel so that they know exactly what they're getting and they should be able to answer them, and then we'll go to the audience, and I look forward to them putting them more on the spot. But the first question is to you, Kathy, and it says that are there volcanoes out there we just don't know about? And if the answer to that is almost certainly yeah, how do we know what they're likely to do?
There are certainly volcanoes we don't know about. Steve mentioned, he gave you a number for the number of quaternary volcanoes. He also gave you a number for the number of active volcanoes, but then he said every other year a volcano erupts that hasn't erupted historically. Now, part of that is because the historic record is very imperfect. And in fact, Steve and I have been working with Jean-T Rougier in the maths department to try to figure out just how imperfect the record is. And our best guess at the moment is we have a complete record of eruptions only since 1980. So that's for active volcanoes. But one other really exciting thing that's been happening over the last 10 years in particular is we have a lot more exploration of our oceans. And remember that the oceans cover more than 70% of the Earth's surface. And in fact, we've recently started to discover that there are lots of volcanoes that are currently erupting under the oceans. We also know there have been some very large eruptions from submarine volcanoes. So we have a lot to learn about those.
Thank you very much. Ryerson, I think in a sense you touched on it a bit, but basically the question is it difficult for people to believe or trust scientists when they say a community is at risk? And the questioner goes on to say, I imagine this is a particular problem when a volcano has been dormant for years and people believe there to be a risk, to be no risk. And I guess it overlaps in the comments that Frank was making earlier.
Well, the facile response is both yes and no. It's an exceptionally complex question because there are so many things driving that interaction between communities and the scientists. And in fact, in most states, the scientists will not communicate directly with the population to pass on the message about a potential risk. That will often come through government, through officials that are involved in disaster risk management. And that then begs the question, to what extent does the population trust the government? And we can guess that in not all states, the level of trust is particularly high. In Ecuador, where I've done a lot of the research, if the police come knocking on your door, you bolt it and you go upstairs. So the idea then that the government is going to provide a message on the risk of a possible impending disaster is going to be attenuated by the rest of the politics going on around that. This then gets us into the broader question, what happens if they're talking about a potential risk, not in the next 24, 48, or 72 hours, but something that might happen a week from now, a year from now, a decade from now. This is going to then come into conversation with the other risks, the other concerns that people have. So in Ecuador, people are moving knowingly into a high-risk zone from the volcano Cotopaxi. But they're doing that because Quito is so dangerous. So they're making a choice to live with one risk because it will lower another type of risk. So I guess the answer to this is it's much more complex, much more difficult for us to wrap our heads around than simply a question about whether or not they trust the scientists.
Thank you. Frank, well, the first question is very personal. It's what is it like to manage a disaster, and what can be what can be done to help manage the risk when it hits? And the questioner goes on to say, I imagine that with a volcano it all happens very suddenly, and that in the future we might need to focus resource on warnings rather than post-event issues, which is one of the questions that was posed to Steve. So Frank, please.
Well, I've detected 4 parts to that question. I will try to be brief. Looking back on the event 20 years ago, it was terrifying and awesome. I became responsible for the lives of nearly 13,000 people. But at the time, it was challenging, exhilarating, 100 hours a week for months on end, satisfying when the work of the on-island response teams came together, extremely frustrating when it didn't. One of the great responsibilities was trying to understand and then coordinate the response of the input of 3 very different teams of scientists, coordinating the British forces landed ashore and acting as peacemaker when periodically we all broke out between the British military and the local defence force, acting as chairman of cabinet, trying to get the rest of ministers to take the correct decisions for the safety of their community, attempting to influence critical British government departments over the use of aid. And if any of you have ever worked with Clare Short, at times that became the biggest issue of the lot. What can be done to help manage the risk when it hits? All my experience has been in Montserrat and following that 20 years working in small countries and micro-states as advisors to the Foreign Office on disaster mitigation and management. So my experience is limited to assisting tiny countries, and it would be different in the case of much larger countries. There's a need for rapid assistance from overseas, regionally and internationally. A small community doesn't have the expertise or the resources to handle a major critical incident. But there are dangers. Most donors will try to kill the affected country with kindness. In Montserrat, we had 20-foot containers in our tiny port, stopping more essential stuff coming in, filled with water. Montserrat, one of its plentiful supplies was water. And the good people of Birmingham sent 20-foot containers of winter clothing to the Caribbean, which they were thinking very kindly, but of no use. So small teams of professionals working, and this is quite important, under the direction of a senior local person is one of the most effective ways forward. But I could give a series of lectures on how you try to get that right. Will a volcano? It happens very suddenly. Not always, but in Montserrat, yes. The telephone rang on the 18th of July. I was told that black snow was falling on the village of Kinsale, and there was an aircraft engine noise from the mountains. That was the start of my 2.5-year odyssey. I was a volcano virgin when it started. 2.5 years later, I think I possibly qualified for an honorary GCSE in volcanology. In the future, we might need to focus resources on warning rather than post-event issues. I think this part of the question goes right to the hub of the issue, particularly for small states. Disasters happen. You can't do anything to stop a natural disaster. That is a fact. But if you want to prevent the loss of life or to mitigate against loss of buildings and infrastructure, there is a need for a well-planned and well-rehearsed mitigation program, which is the work I've been doing for the last 20 years. But mitigation programs can only succeed when they're based upon expert opinion and research into the anticipated risk to the community. At that stage, the community can be educated about the local risk, the actions they need to take when disasters are forecast or predicted, and a well-rehearsed family community plan put in place. And in Montserrat, I think the community there are the best educated in volcanic risk, as well as being very, very resilient to hurricanes because of their frequency.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to open the floor to questions. And there's a gentleman right in this second row here. Can you just wait until the microphone reaches you? Somebody will be approaching very quickly. Yes, please, sir.
Ralph Hoyt, poet. On the list of things which are going to end the human race, which includes, of course, the singularity, Donald Trump, and possibly the Russians, how high do volcanoes rank?
Okay. Well, compared with Donald Trump, I think fairly...
I was going to say, can I answer
that? They probably make about as much noise, and they're about as much use, but that is a prejudice. If I may, I'll take a more technical question now. Yes, you, sir, there in the beard on the left-hand side. You keep your hand up, and the man is coming with a...
There's a lot of discussion about reactive response to volcanoes, and I was picking up on your point about trying to be proactive. I was interested with the tsunamis. There was, out of that came international collaboration with regard to prediction and sort of prevention, catastrophe prevention. And I wondered how far there is international collaboration with regard to volcanic eruptions. And I also wanted to know how far that has moved into proactive advice for governments to do things like putting buildings, particularly vulnerable buildings like hospitals, schools, etc., in places that are safer.
Thank you. That's very clear. I'm going to ask both, probably all our panellists to answer on that. So I'll start with you and I'll move through the panel, if I may. So,
yeah,
Kathleen.
In terms of international collaboration, Steve mentioned one way that that's happening, and that's through development of this, what's called the global volcano model. But the volcanology community is actually profoundly international, and we always get teased for the amount that we travel, and we always run into each other on volcanoes. So there is, especially erupting volcanoes, so there is quite a bit of discussion, collaboration, and sharing of knowledge. And this is important because, as Steve has showed, the UK has no volcanoes, but except Montserrat. They didn't realize they did. But you have to be aware of and responsive to volcanic eruptions, and you learn about those by traveling around the world and working on active volcanoes. So there's a lot of collaboration in terms of looking to the future. There's also a lot of work being done, and Steve has led the charge on this in large part for really trying to identify globally where the biggest hazards are. There's a lot of work being done by the whole volcanology group here as well as around the world on starting to make better probability maps. Now, as someone pointed out here, it's always probabilities. So when you say, we always have to say a 1 in 3 chance, not it's going to happen 30 years from now.
Okay, thank you. Ryerson.
There's an awful lot being done internationally to try to address disasters writ large. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that the total losses over the last decade was well over $1 trillion from natural disasters. So there's been a recent Sendai Agreement on disaster risk reduction and resilience that is trying to put in place norms across the planet on how to address, prepare for, respond to natural hazards. The other thing I'd stress, though, is natural disasters are not an equal opportunity threat. They don't affect everyone equally. There's been a long history within disaster studies that takes a look at vulnerability. It's the poorest, the people that have the least life opportunities that are going often to be the most affected by disasters. So part of it is about a broader development project, about making sure that other people, most of the people on the planet, have the ability to respond, to become more resilient.
Okay, thank you. Frank?
Just take the last point. How do you get governments to build infrastructure away from the volcanoes? Some countries do. Countries which have a high frequency of volcanic eruption, Japan, Iceland, I think have got infrastructure in the right place. But when you come to small countries, the opportunity to move your capital 15, 20 miles away, just doesn't happen. And And I spent a very uncomfortable hour and a half before a Commons Select Committee being asked what idiot spent £25 million of our money rebuilding Plymouth. Why did you put the hospital there? Well, my retort to that, which I bit my tongue and didn't say, well, what British government idiots are trying to build on the floodplain of the Thames? But I contained myself. I took the licks for it because the panel only wanted a scapegoat. I don't think small communities, unless you're going to get a very large country to come in, fund putting the facilities elsewhere. Montserrat's only 12 miles by 7. The hospital needs to be where the community is. And you might think going 12 miles will only take you, 10 minutes in one of your cars. It doesn't. To get to the northern part of the island, it will take you 40, 45 minutes.
Thank you very much. Other questions, please. There's a complete domination of questions on the left-hand side of the room. I do not understand that. But yes, you, ma'am, this lady here. Just keep your hand up and somebody will come with a microphone. Okay, please.
Just a slightly more sort of physical side of things. I understand that earthquakes can be quite useful indicators for an impending eruption. Do you think that advances in seismology in that essence are intrinsically advances in then volcanology as well?
Thank you. That's clearly for you, Kathy.
Yeah, certainly earthquakes are one of the best indicators that an eruption is about to happen, but there are a lot of other indicators that we use, and something that's been very exciting over the last 20 years are advances in satellite-based observations, and particularly looking at ground deformation. We can also see hot areas, we can measure volcanic gases, and this is useful for two reasons. Number one, the satellites are doing global searches all the time, so you can start developing a global monitoring network. And second of all, it's always good when the scientists don't have to be on the ground on top of the volcano making the measurements. So certainly seismology is important, but there are a lot of other tools that we have.
Thank you very much. So, other questions? There's somebody right at the back of the hall there, a lady by the look of it. Yeah. Probably good if you sort of stood up to ask the question, because the acoustics are not brilliant even with the microphone. Please.
So there were some really interesting graphs from Steve's talk at the beginning about the impact of volcanic eruptions on the climate, and I was just wondering about what your thoughts are about potential future eruptions in line with climate change predictions.
Thank you. I think that's you, Kathy, again, isn't it?
Okay, yes. Steve showed the impacts, and certainly you might think that maybe we'd want to have a few more volcanic eruptions to cool things off. But as he showed, number one, the impacts for what I'd call the maximum likely eruption that we'd experience are only going to be for a few years. And that it doesn't uniformly cool the planet. And in fact, it depends very much on where the volcano is located and even what the season is, because it depends on the global circulation, atmospheric circulation, and how that interfaces.
Thank you. Other questions, please? Anybody from the right-hand side? Yes, finally. You, sir.
Good evening, all. I appreciate there's some interesting interdisciplinary collaborations going on here. Has anyone considered discussing with architects and engineers to see whether buildings could be made not perhaps volcano-proof? I'm talking about civil buildings which could be used as evacuation centres. I noticed from the films that with the flooding, it's probably not going to exceed perhaps 2 stories. The pyroclastic flow, I noticed in one of the images, there was a church tower protruding from these. There is a potential that buildings will remain standing after these events.
Thank you very much. That's clear. I think I've probably got to you, Ryerson, if that's okay on that.
It's unfortunate that we don't have an engineer on the panel, but we work very closely, volcanology, disaster risk managers, with engineering to make sure to provide exactly that type of infrastructure. And it's not unusual at all, assuming the state has the resources to do it.
It's expensive.
And that's a crucial point. because these, depending on the type of infrastructure, you're talking about major investments. To put in place dams for lahars, to put in place refuges, to build better bridges that may withstand the types of threats that you're talking about, to make electrical infrastructure more resilient. Which I guess is a long roundabout way of saying, yes, absolutely, engineering is a core component. That's the practical side of a lot of these endeavors.
Frank, do you want to add anything to that?
Not really. I've got no expertise in that. In Montserrat, the timescale was too short. In evacuating people to the northern end of the island, we were moving them into church halls and school buildings, which were totally inadequate. But
Okay.
certainly, I think modern engineering, you can produce buildings which, at appropriate distance, would protect the population from the worst of the effects.
Thank you. Kathy, you wanted
I was
to
just
add?
going to really quickly say another example of engineering that has been used successfully and is being used is not for explosive eruptions, but more for lava flow eruptions. So the Italians in particular have on several occasions built diversion barriers to sort of deflect lava flows away from infrastructure, and they've done that fairly successfully.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, a gentleman here and then a lady here. So we moved from the left-hand side, we're now to the right, which is sort of resurged in its interest. Sir, please.
As Kathy said, it's all a matter of probabilities. At what level do you actually take action in terms of probabilities? And if you make a prediction of moving populations, or don't make a prediction of moving populations and get it wrong, then what do you do? And in fact, wasn't there a case a little while ago, some legal action was taken against some scientists or something in was it Italy or somewhere? I can't remember, in the press.
It was in Italy.
It was
how do you
complicated.
handle,
It
how
was
do you make
Italy.
decisions in relation to the probability issue?
Okay, well, who wants to answer that? Kathy and then Ryerson?
I'll get started and then Ryerson. So yes, as Frank said, there's this terrible line that people have to walk between crying wolf and getting it wrong. And I would say this is first of all, it's a general challenge in volcanology because the Met Office can get things wrong every day and it doesn't really matter. No, you guys do a good job. But we don't have the experience and we don't have the sort of daily probabilities to build up. But also, the decisions are usually made through a chain of command. And that's, as Ryerson said, typically the scientists provide their best advice to people like Frank or to civil emergency managers who then make the decision, particularly for something like evacuations, because evacuations typically will kill some people just in the process of the evacuation. So it's...
Thank you. Ryerson?
The changing legal regimes have certainly made this much more complex, and the scientific community is trying, I think, to wrap their heads around how to respond. But at the end of the day, what it comes down to is that the scientists have a responsibility to get the science right to the best of their ability, which doesn't mean they won't make mistakes, but they have to, I guess, undertake that task with the intent of doing their best job. We don't expect someone that goes into surgery to come out successfully every time. There's a recognition that sometimes things can go wrong. But providing the surgeon has done what is considered best practice, then everyone understands the potential dangers. When it comes to natural hazards, for some reason, there is a bit more of a conversation now about how we wrap our heads around this idea about a professional responsibility. It's going to take some time for, I guess, the fallout from L'Aquila to work its way through not just the Italian legal system, but throughout the rest of the European or global legislative communities.
Can I make one?
Yeah.
Just one quick follow-up. An example, well, Steve gave a couple of examples where the disaster was not because of the scientists, it was because of politics or other issues. And certainly the lahar that went through Armero, the scientists had produced hazard maps, and Armero had been covered by lahars in the 1800s and in the 1500s. And so the hazard map for that activity was actually correct.
Okay. Anything to add, Frank?
As an administrator in a volcanic eruption scenario, you are virtually totally dependent upon advice from your scientific team. Initially in Montserrat, it was very difficult because we had two teams, the best in the world, United States Geological Survey, and a very small Caribbean team, who were saying totally opposite things. And I reached a point I was so exasperated, I asked for a British scientific advisor, and that's where Professor Willie Aspinall came riding to the rescue, and Professor Steve Sparks pretty closely afterwards. And for the first time, it was a bit of a painful business, but they ensured that we got a consensus from the scientists. The Chief Minister and I spent every Monday night 3 to 4 hours sitting with the team of scientists as they debated the issues, and we met with them every day. So that's how dependent we were upon them. But at the end of the day, they offer advice, and it's the administrators who have to take the decision.
Thank you. This lady in the front row here.
You said that people were often reluctant to listen to and cooperate with governments in terms of warnings of eruptions. Do you think that they would be more cooperative if the information and the warning came from independent organisations and scientists, or would there still be an issue of cooperation?
I think that's for you, Ryerson, isn't it? I don't think it's answerable, but...
Yeah, it's going to vary from one jurisdiction to the next. One of the questions we asked over 350 households in Ecuador was the extent to which they trusted science, and did they understand what scientists did? You know, what is the job of a volcanologist, for example? And most of them had no idea, but they would still trust them, providing they weren't seen as being linked with the government. But that will vary from one jurisdiction to the next. One of the difficulties is if you break that link between the advice and the state, does that begin to erode the responsibility of the state? You know, we expect that the government has a responsibility to meet the needs of its population. If you break that link, there may be unintended consequences, which I wouldn't even want, I guess, to guess what they may be.
There's a very nice quotation from President Obama which says that it is the obligation of politicians to take the advice of scientists even when it's inconvenient, in fact, especially when it's inconvenient. And I think that's a very good touchstone of how you deal with some of these issues. Thank you. It's a very tough question to answer, and as Ryerson has weaseled, it depends. So, other questions, please. Yes, you, sir, over there. Gentleman on the right on the far left, about halfway up.
Thank you. It's a two-part question. Are there eruptions that cannot be predicted at all, given all our new science that we have that you've just been talking about? And what proportion of people who are vulnerable to eruptions are not covered by any early warning systems?
Okay, thank you. That's pretty clear. First to Kathy and then possibly to Ryerson, yeah?
Yeah. There are certainly eruptions that at this moment cannot be predicted. And we've seen examples recently in Japan and in New Zealand. And these are eruptions, they're fairly small. They're called phreatic eruptions, which just means if you have magma below the surface that heats up groundwater, if that groundwater flashes, it can cause quite a large eruption. So now I see one of my colleagues in the very back who is a seismologist, and I think he thinks that maybe they're starting to think that there might be some seismic signals that could tell you, but those definitely come without warning. There have been other eruptions that ramp up very quickly. There was one in Chile that had maybe 4 hours of warning, and even in hindsight, going back, there were apparently no signals. So that's unusual. Typically, we get at least days, often weeks to months of buildup, but not always.
Do you want to add, Ryerson?
I wouldn't want to hesitate a guess on what percentage of the population that is vulnerable to a volcanic hazard has access to an early warning system. But we could take that further and ask what percentage of people living with a volcanic hazard have their own coping strategies, their own ways within their community of responding to something that begins to ramp up. That's another question entirely. What I can comment on directly, places like Ecuador, where money has been given to put in place early warning, big public announcement systems, it sits in warehouses because the money gets siphoned off. It depends on where you are. The richer, the more developed the state is, the more likely it is that there's going to be an effective early warning and announcement system in place.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. You, sir, right at the front.
Probably speak loudly enough.
No, I think it's a big hall, I can tell you. He's here. Thank you.
Do we have a sense of the degree to which people who live with the threat of volcanoes in many parts of the world are really worried about them? Or are there many more things in life that they're more worried about than something that might happen in a few years or in a few decades?
That's more philosophical, really. Frank, why don't you kick off with that?
Well, the island of Tristan da Cunha, which is the most remote community anywhere in the world, they evacuated themselves in 1961. About 5 years ago, a subterranean volcano started up, and the community sort of hid the evidence from the administrator because they had such a difficult time when they were evacuated. They are determined they are not going to move, they're going to stay come what may. And the people on Montserrat who remained, very well educated, they know the risks. And the scientists have told them that the top part of the island is safe and they're rebuilding their homes. They want to stay. They could not be persuaded to leave.
Okay, thanks. Any comment from you, too? Yeah,
people live around volcanoes for all sorts of good reasons. There's lots of pull factors that bring people into those spaces. Often it's some of the most fertile ground. There's reasons to build houses and farms and communities on their slopes. It can be higher up than particularly problematic weather. There's all sorts of reasons, good rational reasons, to move there. They can be aware of the volcanic hazard, of the risk of being there, but that doesn't mean that they are going to keep that at the forefront of their minds. Cotopaxi, where we were doing interviews, which subsequently erupted, I think roughly 85% of the people didn't even list the volcano in one of their top 10 sources of insecurity in their daily lives. That doesn't mean that they're not concerned, and it certainly doesn't mean that if an alarm went off, they wouldn't evacuate. But that does indicate that there are other issues getting in the way, and that has to affect the way that we communicate with them. We have to take that into account to make sure that we're not, I guess, over-egging the pudding a bit, which will just force some people to stop listening.
Thank you very much. Kathy, you want to add?
Just real quickly, I thought I'd end with a follow-up on that. And certainly in a lot of parts of the world, volcanoes are the last thing people are worried about. They're worried about putting food on their table. And that's an example of that was the recent hurricane that hit Haiti. And at least from reports, people, they knew that this hurricane was coming. They'd been told to move to safer places. And they said, if we move, people will steal our stuff. And we're going to stay. And so they had a very high death toll. That's really shows the social dimension of it that has nothing to do with the natural hazard, but really has to do with social structures.
All right, look, that's all the questions we have time for this evening. We've had a fantastic evening, in my view. We've had some very, very deep, insightful work from Steve, including some of these rather splendid films which hopefully will actually help people to adjust to some of these issues of volcanoes. We've had a splendid set of answers from our panel, including the answers to the questions that their aunties and uncles gave them, so give them to start off. And I think I'd just like to sort of close the evening with a slight anecdote, is that when I was the Chief Scientific Advisor, I was asked to set up this Science Advisory Group in emergencies to advise the government COBRA committee. And when I actually got people to actually bring the experts in, 3 of the people are actually in this room from the Bristol group, which doesn't mean we got it right, but we did. But it indicates that these are the people who are up there on the government agenda. The one thing I forgot to mention earlier, but unfortunately we've missed one of our panel members, Caroline Williams, who is from a very different discipline. She's a historian, and it would have brought us a really terrific new perspective. Unfortunately, she has illness in the family and was not able to come. But I think our panel, despite having the inability in scholarship history to answer those questions, which I think many of them were relevant to it. So can I ask you now to thank our panel and Steve Sparks and the Cabot Institute in the usual way. Thank you.